Welcome to the fourth episode of my historical exploration series on the graveyard from the massively multiplayer text-based game GemStone III. Now GemStone IV, of course, since late 2003, though it has been the same Atlantean world setting since late 1995. But the subject of this series, the graveyard, is mostly concerned with GemStone III, and even more specifically with the first half of GemStone III, which was called the Ice Age and was before I started playing. I'm your host, the player Xorus. In the introduction video, I explained the out-of-game motivation for this history series, how we want to understand the grand design of the graveyard. The graveyard is one of the very oldest parts of Gemstone and was built when the game was based on very different documentation. In the second episode, I restored the missing context of the graveyard and its backstory, explaining the details in terms of the archaic world setting of Kelfour. The third episode was what you might call deep context, or a subtextual dive into the surrounding world setting, into ice material not explicitly mentioned in the story, but which might be relevant implicitly. While the Library of Namikos is explicitly mentioned in the graveyard in its story, for example, and I described Namikos in episode 2, something more subtle like the manuscripts being laid out in nooks in the Library of Namikos could also be relevant, in the implicit sense of a fixed element of room design more deeply alluding to or playing off the source book. The manuscript and volume in the crypt are perhaps intentionally backwards from this point. Instead of laying flat like Namikos manuscripts, they must be standing up, with their covers facing outward, unless there is a space warp involved, which, given the graveyard, is not impossible. Similarly, the Namikos scrolls are inside niches, and the manuscripts are mostly on nooks. In the crypt, the manuscripts are instead on a stone niche, so it's backwards. These details, including Namikos having vaults and a reference department, come from the Jaimon book from 1989. They were not in the Namikos section of the Master Atlas from 1989. They had to have come from Jaimon, which is important for interpreting the graveyard because it implies that book was used. There is also arguably a reasonable parallel between some of the specific room details around the crypt and the locations where the Helm of Kadena artifact was hidden in the Demons of the Burning Night book from 1989, which was a theocracy ruled by Empress Kadena's surviving mortal daughter, who was a contemporary of Bandar Etrivion. One of these involved a scroll room with a niche 7 feet off the floor. In the crypt, the niche is out of reach, just under the ceiling. The Aranyarch in the crypt, less likely, could have been inspired by the Great Hall and the Egyptian-themed Kingdom of Gethira. But the Aranyarch is backwards in itself. Aranyarch absorbs radiation. Aranyarch in the crypt is used to radiate light. So these are what I would call subtext or perhaps deep context, a layer of meaning implicitly present. In the case of the Shadow World setting, we know some of these books were used. It's more of a question of which parts were used. The ice source books can be thought of as providing parallels to what exists in the game, but at some point the parallel breaks down and there can be accidental parallels. What we were doing was holding up pieces of the source books and asking, what would these details in Gemstone be implying if this source material was supposed to be relevant to it? By within Gemstone setting context alone, you could reasonably surmise the underground stronghold on the coastal cliffs is related to the graveyard story, but you would not realize the dark wisplings are artificial elementals, which only existed as a buried detail in the Elemental Companion book from 1989. And you would not have recognized the violence of the stronghold as more specifically consistent with the Demons of the Pale. While the Wisplings essentially had to have come from this random other book, the Demons of the Pale hypothesis is potentially only coincidence. The creators might have had something else in mind, or possibly even nothing in mind, just savagery and brutality with extreme force. When a fixed element in the game so much as glancingly references something in an outside source, it leverages a whole bunch of surrounding material that has to be sorted. If it's just a loose source of inspiration, there's nothing really you're going to be able to find. But if it's not just a loose source of inspiration, if it's more of a matter of illusion, then there can be a lot more there. This creates some illusion of depth in having to explain it, figuring out which of the possible implications matter. Because if you already know the context, and especially the intent, it is not really all that deep. You would know this part and that part matter, and all those parts over there do not. In any case, that is subtext involving texts we know were used at some point. There's just uncertainty whether they are relevant in these cases. It's a bit like shooting arrows at invisible targets when you know that they're invisible targets. You know they're probably there, but you can't see them. You have to look around carefully and figure out where they're hidden. When we are guessing that some other text was relevant, without actually knowing if it was used or not, that implicit or hidden meaning can be considered allegory. Instead of just shooting arrows at some invisible targets, it is more like shooting invisible targets when it's a surprise that they even exist. You will hit stuff randomly if you fire randomly, but if you hit upon a pattern that is really there, so to speak, quote unquote, you can hit a whole bunch of stuff that must be right. For example, every fifth room of plane 1 and 2 of the Rift, if you number it the right way, is a Major Arcana tarot card, all 22 of them in exact sequential order. This is an extreme case in the lack of ambiguity, but there is no immediate reason to believe the Rift had anything to do with tarot. There are, however, more cryptic reasons for thinking the Rift should have had something to do with prophecy, and is probably not a purely random thing that was done without motivation. It is something that can be figured out beyond dumb luck. So, as opposed to deep context in paleohistory, this would be an example of cryptohistory. When there is a higher concept to things, you can figure out their hidden logic. What about implicit layers of meaning that are not necessarily pointing to external sources? Off-canon higher concepts fall under this kind of subtext. You could consider the mirror or everything's backwards motif to be something like this, and symbolism could at least partly fall under this category. That is, when something is symbolic, it might be building a layer of meaning in its own terms. In this episode, we will be looking at death in Gemstone and how it relates to the symbolism of the graveyard. There is no way to prove, strictly speaking, that symbolism was intended. All you can do is construct an argument for it. Then you have to decide whether it is plausible. The graveyard and the death mechanics were made at roughly the same time, so it would not be surprising if they are related to each other. As you will see, death in Gemstone is off-canon as well, and might have allegorical stuff about it. So we would have the off-canon graveyard symbolically related to off-canon death. This is treacherous and a higher degree of speculation than what we were doing in episodes 2 and 3, the Shadow World source books. So we will first contrast death in Gemstone with what is done in I.C.E. and Shadow World. Then we will look at the Shadow World death symbolism of the graveyard. Then we will get more ambitious and look into the more cryptic meanings that might be encoded in the death mechanics, which has some really weird messaging that has nothing to do with the Shadow World setting. Lastly, I will start pointing out the first examples of possible crypto-history, of allegory unrelated to Shadow World encoded in the death symbolism. In the 5th episode, I will go all the way and construct a unifying theory that ties it all together in terms of real-world literature and comparative mythology. This allegorical interpretation will either be mostly right or a diabolically clever way of being completely wrong. To start with, we will look at how injury and death works in Rolemaster, the game mechanics source books. I do not have character law from back then, but I do have spell law from 1989. The later Rolemaster books say essentially the same things on death. It was probably essentially the same in 1989. So, broadly speaking in Rolemaster, living requires both the soul and the body together. Even artificial constructs like golems have spirits in them. Without the soul and the body can be minimally alive. essentially in a coma. Absolution spells do this temporarily, with two exceptions. Absolution Pure permanently rips the soul out unless a life-giving spell is cast, which is to say the character is raised. The other exception is Dark Absolution, where the soul is destroyed. Spell law includes caveats about how the soul must exist for life-giving spells to work, and that language was carried over into Gemstone spell lists. It was never relevant in a mechanical sense in Gemstone, it was just language borrowed out of context. The sorcerer profession in Gemstone, for example, uses the Rolemaster class description for sorcerers, but the sorcerer profession in Gemstone has never fit that definition very well, because only some of our sorcerer spells were actually sorcerer spells. Others were adapted from the evil spell lists, but that's a whole subject in itself. If you were playing in the 1990s and looked through Rolemaster spell law, you would recognize a whole lot of the spells. This is where our profession spell list mostly came from. There's a great deal of redundancy in spell law, and there are typically several spells of each kind in a spell list, which are increasingly more powerful versions of the same effect. You can still see this in the minor elemental and spirit lists, such as with Elemental Defense 1, 2, and 3, originally called Guarding 1, 2, and 3, commonly still called Guards. There used to be a lot more of this in Gemstone. 4 Repel Undead spells, 3 Resurrection spells, 2 Pain spells, 2 Limb Break spells, and so on. These were mostly collapsed down into single spells over the years, making room for other spells by opening up spell slots. In spell law from 1989, it specifies that the healing system is left up to the GMs to figure out how they want to handle it, and it does not micromanage the rules for death. Rolemaster has been derisively called Chart Master. Imagine if you had to consult charts in a tabletop setting and were keeping track of all your critical injuries, as opposed to just how many hit points you have left. All that stuff Gemstone does for you automatically. But crit tables and all that come from Rolemaster. There are charts for everything. Rolemaster provides a lot of herbs in broad categories of healing function with various costs, and that is where all of the original herbs originated. But this is generically stuff like nerve repair, organ repair, and so on. Some of our herbs are a bit off-canon in what they actually do. The Ice Materials page on our wiki sorts that all out in painstaking detail. The mechanics for minor and major wounds and scars and the specific herbs being associated to those specific functions seems to have only existed in Gemstone. Herbs were sold by the herbalist, but from what I can tell, early on the potions were sold by the alchemist. Some of the town NPCs come from the Kelbourne book. Some only existed in Gemstone. The herbalist was only Gemstone. The alchemist was from the source book. Rolemaster also allows for healing factors that vary across races. In Gemstone, we only naturally heal hit points. Critical damages never heal on their own. When you are dead in Rolemaster, you take damage to your stats, especially mental stats, because of oxygen deprivation. Generally, the longer you are dead in Rolemaster, the more time to recover. The GM could impose lingering effects, such as XP loss or lost memory. You're not whole when you come back from the dead, basically. There's always been some form of death sting. The overall trend has been toward death in Gemstone becoming less and less harsh. It is virtually inconsequential now, with our death salves. So, Rolemaster provides a lot of options for different ways of handling things. There often isn't a single, this is how it works in all cases. The exact way the death mechanics have worked in Gemstone has changed over time. It is sometimes done stat damage, sometimes XP loss. But Gemstone is fundamentally different from Rolemaster in one major respect. It is not a tabletop game with a low rate of encounters. The number of encounters with monsters in Gemstone is absurdly high. We kill thousands upon thousands of monsters. and for the same reason, the frequency of character death in Gemstone is absurdly high. It would be a much lower level game if everyone played hardcore style. Rolemaster in Shadow World, by the way, is supposed to be a roughly 20 level game. Level 20 is very powerful. Seasoned soldiers and orcs and so on will be under level 10. Something quite powerful might be level 15. Above level 20, you're dealing with the most powerful NPCs in Shadow World. The highest mortals, say a human lore master, might be up to level 40, maybe. The most powerful oldest elves are between levels 60 and 80, around the same level as the demigods. And we're talking 10,000 years elves that are that powerful. The most powerful dragons are around 80 to 100. The dark gods are around 80 to 140. And the light gods are around 140 to 220. They're physical incarnations, that is. Though the moon gods, they are projecting themselves great distances, so they take a penalty for that. We do not have that kind of NPC power scaling clearly defined in Atlantia. So people argue about stuff like elves taking much longer than humans to reach the same level of power and it not making any sense. Whereas in Shadow World, there is no such ambiguity. Old elves are much more powerful. That's probably how it should be in Atlantia. Fewer elves, superior skill due to longevity. Somewhat delayed, but not ridiculously delayed. So, Gemstone was essentially built as a 20-level game, then got stretched out to nearly level 300, then compressed back down into 100 levels. There was a soft cap at level 160 for a little while, where people already over 160 were frozen in place. Then there was the hard cap where everything got compressed to 100. And level 100 in GemStone IV is roughly level 161.5 in GemStone III. My GS3 level Lich script does all the conversions for you. Version 1.0 does it for plain vanilla XP. Version 1.1 gives you the numbers for both ordinary XP and total XP, because we have a separate XP pool now for Ascension points, mostly used for post-cap development. But digression aside, characters will not last very long typically with a tabletop level of forgiveness for death, given Gemstone's very high rate of encounters with dangerous monsters. So Gemstone has to be set up in a way that prevents inevitable permanent character death, even if permanent death is possible without preventive measures. Originally up through 2004 or so, permanent death existed for player characters. It was prevented by having deeds. Deeds do not exist in Rolemaster, and they do not exist in Shadow World. As far as I can tell, deeds only exist in Gemstone. People still speak of deeds as though they are the reason adventurers get brought back, but that has not been true for almost 20 years. There is no in-character rationale that I am aware of for why our murder hobos are bouncy balls with death and the NPCs are not. Maybe things have been established at Ebongate storylines. I do not know. That kind of stuff is pretty badly recorded. Deeds at present only have the effect of Lormitra going out of her way to make death's sting less harsh. So we will have to look into the whole deeds thing because that is off canon. Next, there is the issue of what being dead means, because strictly speaking, our characters are never actually dead. Yes, you heard me right. Our characters are never dead. Dead in the ice sense of being dead. They are only clinically dead, technically dead. The Diet Coke of dead. What happens is we are dying, essentially flatlining. It's like in Dungeons & Dragons where you have some number of rounds to heal someone. In Rolemaster, it is specified that a typical human has 12 rounds, 2 minutes. It was 4 minutes at one point in Gemstone. If this state of dying lasts too long, we would become properly dead. But that is not what happens for us. Those of us with favor from the Death Goddess instantly decay into compost. Then she finds our soul, tells us we're idiots, and we get reincarnated. There's messaging with the depart verb that changes depending on how close to decaying, which is, say, actual death, you are. You get colder, you start having out-of-body experiences, you see the tunnel and the white light. But the decaying into dust and reincarnating only happens in Gemstone, at the point the body can no longer hold the soul. This is an important distinction. We think of life, keep, and preservation as the same thing, but they are entirely different spells in spell law. Preservation halts the deterioration of damages like stat loss. It does not prevent the soul from leaving the body. Life keep keeps the soul from departing the body, but does not prevent physical deterioration. There are also restoral spells for undoing those damages, sort of like chrisms in a way, but retroactively, like the death salves. This is where Gemstone is different. According to spell law, you only need to heal someone in this dying, flatlining state. In Gemstone, you have to cast a life-giving resurrection spell in the same situation. But in spell law, the life-giving spells are only for the time after this, when the body is well and truly dead, when the soul's left the body, and you're asking the death goddess to please send it back, so you can stuff it back into its meat suit. You could bring someone back with a life-giving spell even if they have been dead for a year. This is a state that player characters never reach in Gemstone, because we decay into compost as soon as we reach the point of actual death. Our souls go to a timeless void, and eventually the death goddess finds us. The dying state is entered from a critical injury or by running out of hit points, where the shock basically knocks the character unconscious. There is then a time until actual death, which depends on factors like race, much as it does today in Gemstone. There is also what Rolemaster calls soul death, where the spirit can be damaged. This is a hazard of the undead, and some undead do this in Gemstone, what we call spirit death. Spell law and creatures and treasures refer to a constitution stat getting drained by the undead. There are a couple of differences in Gemstone. First, Gemstone uses an optional mechanic based on Constitution from Rolemaster Companion 2 from 1987 called Life Levels. Life levels are now called Spirit, based on Aura, and Spirit going below 0 causes Spirit Death. Low life levels weakens the body, imposing penalties on attack and defense statistics. Those penalty percentages are more harsh in Rolemaster. The penalty modifier used to show up explicitly in the health verb, but that was a very long time ago. In Rolemaster, if your spirit goes below 0, the undead are making you into an undead. In Gemstone, your soul is getting torn apart. There is reference in the old newsletters about your soul getting destroyed from spirit death. That is what it meant. There was a special death messaging for spirit deaths where Isa, or Isa if you prefer to pronounce it the right way, would reassemble your tattered soul. Today this is the only variant, but there used to be several variants. I'm not sure if I've even seen them all. If you decayed with insufficient deeds, you would have permanent character death and would get sent to the character manager to retire your character or character family. But if you had a spirit death with insufficient deeds, a message would go out saying your soul has been lost to the demonic. People conflate the two things, or think demonic was based on society affiliation, but demonic was just the case of permanent death by spirit death. So let's briefly recap how the death mechanics have changed over time in Gemstone, at least the major aspects of it. When you look back in the Kelfour editions from 1990, you see that characters under level 2 were allowed a certain number of deaths. It was really 5 free deaths, but there was a buffer up to 9 deaths. If you had 10 deaths, you would have permanent character loss. More than 5 deaths, but less than 10, you had to buy deeds to offset it. Otherwise, you would permanently die upon reaching level 2. This was changed at some point. In the 1993 newsletter, it sounds like you still got 5 free deaths and were protected from permanent death while at level 1. But beyond 5 deaths, it would start showing up in the deaths this level counter. Regardless, there used to be a special messaging variant for decaying when under level 2 without deeds, though I'm not sure how old it was, if it went all the way back or not. You would see an old man talking to you about the special children, and with great effort he would pull your soul back. Then he would warn you to get deeds because even he is powerless to help beyond a point. I would guess this is supposed to be the old priest in the Landing Temple. They all speak in archaic thy terms. Level 2 and up, you need the deeds to avoid permanent death, and Isa would come along and bring you back. I remember getting rescued by the Great Spirit Volm once in the late 90s while dead in the catacombs. I do not know if that is a defunct mechanic or if it was manually GM triggered. In any case, when you decayed, your soul ended up in a place called Purgatory. I will talk more about Purgatory later. In the 1990 death mechanics, you could suffer stat loss when reaching a new level based on how many deaths this level you had at that level. This was replaced by recent deaths in probably the GemStone IV conversion. You gained deaths this level from decaying, departing, spirit death, and I think resurrection by a cleric without having deeds. This was removed at some point, the stat loss penalty. I'm not sure when though, it was still there in 1993. More well known is the fact that you would drop the items in your hands when you died, and if you decayed, you would drop everything you were wearing. Players would log off and go to messenger boards to coordinate rescues. Item droppage was removed around 1996, roughly, though there are certain special circumstances where item droppage with death still happens. There are places in the game with their own special death mechanics, so some weird quirks can happen. When many of us started playing, departing spirit death caused permanent XP loss, around 5k or 10k XP depending on the details. This was replaced with Death Sting around 2004 roughly, which instead involves temporary stat loss. Permanent death was also removed around 2004 in the GemStone IV conversion. I can pin these all down more precisely, but it's not important. Then beyond 2004, we have Death Sting and the tweaks that have been made to that system. But who cares about Death Sting? We only care about GemStone III in this video. So let's look at death in the Shadow World setting and contrast that with what existed in Gemstone. In the Shadow World setting, Isa, the Orhan death goddess, has a total monopoly on life-giving. It involves her giving the soul back, because the soul has departed. No matter which deity a cleric worships in Shadow World, if they cast the life-giving spell, that is coming from Isa and only with her permission. She is the only god in the world setting with the power to channel that ability to clerics. In the Master Atlas Addendum from 1990, it is specified that other Orhan deities can raise the dead, but they have to physically show up and do it themselves. The spirit of Orhan, Beris, who somehow got renamed both Vorus and Lath and became two different gods in Atlantia, was originally framed as a servant of Isa, whose tears could resurrect the dead, but only if Isa gave him permission to cry. The spirits of Orhan were first defined in 1990 in the Master Atlas Addendum, and the Master Atlas 2nd edition in 1992 clarifies that there are actually dozens of them. More spirits of Orhan and dark spirits of Corone were defined in Shadow World after Simutronics had split from the world setting. The Order of Volt in Gemstone uses the phrase Great Spirit. It looks like that is actually Gemstone specific. In canon, they are also known as the Angels or the Pursuivants. Regardless, clerics as a pure profession were defined as channeling their powers from a single god they worship, as opposed to, say, animists, another pure casting profession of the channeling realm. They are not casting spells per se, they are channeling the power of their deity. So if a cleric worships a local god and are too far away, the cleric is cut off from their spellcasting power. Similarly, if a deity is effectively dead or banished, like Orgiana, the cleric would have severely restricted abilities. Likewise, a mage needs access to the flows of essence, otherwise they cannot cast spells. And mentalists use their own essence, but they have to be in a place where essence exists, so they can't go somewhere else in the universe and use their mentalist powers. The point is that even a cleric of another Orhan deity, when casting a life-giving spell, is actually channeling that ability through Issa. What about clerics of dark gods? Well, that's somewhat complicated because of Rolemaster versus Shadow World. In spell law, the evil cleric profession is a pure who might be allowed to choose from both cleric and evil cleric spell lists. The rules on evil spell lists are left to the discretion of the GMs. In the Shadow World setting, evil spell lists derive from the anti-essence that can only be cast by drawing from dark powers. Canonically, the character has a separate pool of power points for evil spell lists, what we would call mana. And evil professions in Shadow World are supposed to be treated as hybrids, not pures. The Dark Gods were defined in 1990 as chaotic manifestations of the anti-essence, so that dark power is integral to their very natures, which means an evil cleric in Shadow World probably should not have access to any light magic cleric spells, though that is ambiguously defined. So a cleric cannot cast necromancy spells, and an evil cleric should not be able to cast life-giving spells. It is unlikely the Dark Gods can bring back the dead in a non-corruptive way, even if they do it themselves. But either way, only Issa can channel a life-giving spell to clerics. It is explicitly stated, ironclad, draconian. What does that mean for Gemstone? Well, the cleric profession in Gemstone predates the Corone Pantheon and includes nothing from the evil cleric lists. The sorcerer profession in Gemstone was a mix of actual sorcerer spells and spells taken from the various evil spell lists. Strictly speaking, necromancy and demonic summoning are mostly not sorcery in Rolemaster. Sorcery is the immediate, specific destruction of animate and inanimate matter, and if you look at spell law, you can see what that really means. Though sorcerers are inconsistently brought up in this necromancy and demon summoning context repeatedly in the Ice books, and are used as an equivalent for necromancers in a Rolemaster conversion chart. So, long story short, only Issa can do life-giving spells. But recall what that means from spell law. That is bringing back a departed soul, which clerics in Gemstone do not do with resurrection. Life-giving spells are not used on unconscious dying characters in the Ice books. That's just healing. Around 2002, Gemstone gained a deity conversion system where the deities have their own flavors for all of the same spells. Lornon Arcadi are able to resurrect dead bodies, but Lorminstra is the only one who brings souls back. There was a post from GM Verivice in 2000, the gods guru at the time, who said any of the gods can be used to raise the dead, but bringing souls back was only Lorminstra. The souls end up with her under normal circumstances. What about Shadow World? It is a religious belief of Issa followers that after death their souls go to her and end up in another state of being. It is stated it is objectively true that she controls a portal to another plane of existence, called the Gates of Oblivion, where the souls are sent after death. The Gates of Oblivion are a literal portal on Orhan, near the River of Life, fed from the Spring of Youth. In much later Shadow World books, it is specified that souls drift along the flows of essence between Kolthia and Orhan, that the River of Life in this way is not just a river of water. In the Master Atlas Addendum from 1990, the River of Life water has miraculous powers, including the ability to raise the dead. The Order of Old Monastery is symbolically based on this scene, and it is implied the water is River of Life water. There's the spring, the stream, the gate, Issa with her crystal Staff of Doom. The Vault Monastery overlooks the graveyard from the Grand Master's office, and the backstory they tell you is wrong in the Shadow World context. They're essentially saying they were founded by a high-ranking aristocrat in the theocracy of Clysis. Before that theocracy even existed, mind you, during a period the Lords of Orhan were ignoring the world, and so on and so on. It is all wrong in essentially every detail. But the society itself seems to be legit, with the Orhan gods actually showing up in some of the steps of the Path of Enlightenment. It's just this everything is wrong or backwards motif that I talk about with the graveyard. So, Issa has an artifact called the Staff of Doom that she uses to move souls. She can rip souls out of people and put them in the Staff of Doom too, though that only puts their bodies into a deep coma. She also uses the staff to annihilate the souls of creatures of the unlife, which presumably mostly refers to the undead, unless she can put demons in the staff. The Order of Vault in Gemstone makes it sound like the enchanted water is used to purify the souls of the released undead. That's pretty dubious in terms of canon. The words cleansing and mercy may be much more ominous. Later books have none of that. Our fight isn't with the creators of the undead stuff. Vault is totally game for killing off necromancers in the later books. Powers of Light and Darkness, for example, in 2003. Undead and Rollmaster, recall, are often created by other undead as the product of soul death, and the worst possible fate for Issa is the soul being destroyed, which can only happen if someone falls victim to one of the unlife's cruel servants. Though, in Gemstone, she seems to be able to repair the souls of spirit deaths, at least for those who she owes deeds through the ritual ceremony. Gemstone seems to use some concept of soul taint that can be cleansed, like when Council of Light Masters resign. So, Shadow World in 1989 does not specify anything about the nature of the other side of the Gates of Oblivion. By 2003, there is a little more development of Issa in Oblivion, with reincarnation for souls that are not done yet, and afterlives. But Gemstone was using its own Atlantean world setting by that point, with the Ebon Gate instead of the Gates of Oblivion. I'm not sure if we know where exactly the Ebon Gate is in the modern setting. I know there was an issue with it in the Platt instance 20 years ago, but I do not know the details well. The Purgatory mechanic in Gemstone, and what our characters saw in Permanent Death, was something that only existed in Gemstone. It still mentioned the Gates of Oblivion up until 2003 or so, even though the Ebon Gate was used from 1997-ish. Just one of those rare examples of an ICE term getting left unchanged for whatever reason. But it shows that messaging must have existed in the Ice Age. Purgatory is implied to be the other side of the Gates of Oblivion. All of the messaging implies the soul's in an oblivion state of unconsciousness, and that the only difference with Permanent Death is that the soul will eventually find a home in either the light or the darkness, which is totally off canon. There's nothing about that in Shadow World. You never saw yourself entering or exiting the Gates of Oblivion, though the Gates of Oblivion were mentioned in the abstract. In Gemstone, Oblivion seems to be very literal, with your identity and memories totally washing away. Some people need everything to be explicitly spelled out for them. You would need to float through the gates, Issa shaking your hand saying, "Hey, how you doing? Welcome to Oblivion. Here's the meaning of life. Have a cookie." But it's not like that. It's just very strongly implied that you're already in Oblivion, and she pulls you out if she owes you favors. It would seem Purgatory merely refers to the soul not yet ending up in the light or darkness, that you're one of the spirits who could not choose. It was originally represented as a room with obvious exits of light and darkness. I will argue in a bit that the dark path is a play on words, that it might have had a second meaning symbolically in Bander's Theocracy, referring to the dark path in Purgatory. Purgatory has a bunch of weird, surreal language to it, which does not come from Shadow World, except perhaps as a literal interpretation of Oblivion, as I said. More like Sheol than the Purgatory of Dante. So, Gemstone has its own off-canon interpretation of Oblivion and Permanent Death, it has deeds as a get out of death almost free card, which has no basis at all in canon. What about Issa and Lorminstra is different? Some lines from Issa's background lore were dropped from the Lorminstra documentation. Specifically, Issa will refuse to return to the living anyone who died in a significant or meaningful way. A young kid senselessly dies from falling off a rock? Sure. Emperor is assassinated? Sorry, pal. That's bad news for our fortune-hunting heroes who slay monsters. But there's a loophole for people whose missions in the world are not yet complete. You're bonded to Issa and owed her protection through the deed ceremony. Originally, the temple ceremony was the only way to get deeds, and it clearly shows she can refuse your request. Something else is that if someone has lived a full life, she's going to refuse to return the soul. It isn't defined anywhere in Gemstone, but at some point, deeds were not going to save you. That is, humans will not get to be 3,000 years old, having bought deeds. It is specified in 1990 onward that Issa gives half-elves a choice at some point, whether they want to be mortal or immortal. Half-elves in Shadow World are unaging, like elves, until they hit a point where they start aging quickly. Pure elves are immortal except by violence. There's some hint that aging shows up through impurities. One of the founding lore masters is still living. He's well over 12,000 years old. The deed ceremony itself in the Landing Temple is totally off canon. None of this stuff appears anywhere in the Shadow World books. In 1990 onward, there is a group called the Sisters of Issa who are generally present in major cities. There is usually a priestess in their group who is powerful enough to cast life-giving. But the temple and the landing, again, should be older than this documentation. The High Priestess calls herself Daughter of the Night. Issa and Rayon are siblings in the Shadow World books. That's the only thing I can think of for why she would be calling herself that. The old priest, who is probably the Lord High Cleric, says deeds are about showing your life matters more than treasures. The temple has a hall of sacrifice. There is some sense of doing good deeds about all of it. But the meaning of deeds is off canon and can only be speculated. It might be more complex than that point by itself. The gist of it is that you're providing heroic acts as credits to substitute the meaningful deaths for which Issa would ordinarily deny resurrection. The deeds are recorded in the Book of Passing. This has no basis in Shadow World. They also refer to Issa as Death. This bit about your features being unrecognizable from death is the NPC referring to re-rolling your character. The conceit of referring to the game world as the lands comes from the death messaging. It's about as in character as sending e-scrolls. I will dissect deeds and the possible cryptic meanings of the deed ceremony more later in this episode, but it is highly speculative because the whole thing is idiosyncratic to Gemstone. I mentioned that the Order of Old Courtyard from late 1994 is a symbolic representation of Issa's garden before the Gates of Oblivion, which brings us to how the graveyard is symbolic of death religion in Shadow World. The exact same scene is symbolized in the graveyard, but all the details are flipped and made backwards. Instead of the death goddess Issa with her 6 keys to oblivion, there's the male Phantom Gatekeeper with his keys that he shakes at you. The Phantom Gatekeeper is a mocking imitation of Issa. Phantoms and Rollmasters specifically have no awareness or memory of their past lives. Arguably, in the graveyard, they symbolize souls in oblivion. The graveyard gate, as I've said, looks more like a gate of hell. It would look like it is in flames. The spikes are slanted inward on the other side so you can climb in but not out, similar to how the Gates of Oblivion can be entered but not exited. You also cannot drag the dead out of the graveyard into the forest. Instead of a garden, there are poisonous vines, which are trying to kill the living, and the graveyard on the inside is filled with highly lethal plants, as was illustrated in the second episode walkthrough. Instead of there being a river of life and spring of youth in front of the gate like on Orhan, the creek is on the other side and ends in a pestilent bog of undeath. While the graveyard might be enclosed by space warps, the high plateau stretches out past the horizon. This is possibly symbolic of the endlessness in purgatory. Recall that in the graveyard, especially around the crypt, the sun is blocked out by the unnatural shadows. This will come up again in the allegory episode. When you go to the deep underground section of the graveyard, which is hidden, it is literally called a madman's travesty of a throne room in purgatory. This very, very strongly implies that you are supposed to think of that area in terms of purgatory, which was part of the death mechanics in 1990. If this is supposed to be purgatory, then originally that dug-up tunnel was not there, so there was no way out. Which means Bander knew grave robbers would get trapped down there and get killed, forming the pile of bodies and body parts in that cavern. These would symbolize the spirits of all those who could not choose in purgatory, between the light and darkness. So the only path in the graveyard design is down, the path into the darkness. And there is no path up into the light, where the sun is blotted out, like in Andrax's vision of the unlife in the introduction to the Master Atlas World Guide. So, that could be a double meaning to the word dark path, which is a phrase that came from the Master Atlas about casting evil spells. If you look at the room painting in the deepest level, you can see that the wording parallels wording in the purgatory messaging. The shaken but alive line parallels the reincarnation message, bewildered by what is transpired, but alive. And coldness penetrating into your very soul as opposed to the scorching of your very soul. What else? Well, as I mentioned in the third episode, Bander is a dark mirror of the Lord High Cleric. Granted, he was over 6,000 years ago. Bander is the Lord High Sorcerer of the Dark Path Theocracy with its rosaries and genteel facade of prayer. The scroll room in the crypt is arguably a dark mirror of the Lord High Cleric office, which has priceless scrolls and manuscripts of light knowledge as opposed to dark knowledge, apparently being guarded implicitly by a Shangrimai monk. Then if you look at the false door in the crypt, it bears a mystical symbol. This strongly parallels the reincarnation altar in the temple, which has a very similar symbol. The overall flow, then, is human sacrifice instead of the hall of sacrifice in the temple, where lives are sacrificed in homage to Bander. Grave robbers being people who valued their material world baubles more than their lives and sacrificed themselves for it. In the burial mound, you also see the deeds of Kestrel Etrivion, and the story refers to Bander's foul deed in killing Kestrel. This may well be playing off the deeds in the death mechanics. The cannibalism-themed Great Hall in the deep underground can invert the Hall of Sacrifice in the temple, with the dais in the temple versus the dais in the throne room with the throne of human ivory. The tapestry and storeroom of junk behind the dais could parallel the tapestry to the deed ceremony, where the material sacrifices are taken away by the acolytes. The frieze in the crypt also says in homage to that which defies death itself, where death is capitalized and probably personified like it is in the temple. What about Kadena Thrak Farak, the invocation element in cult mantra on the false door, Kadena, guardian of the forbidden in Ireric? If the dark path is supposed to be a dark mirror of the death religion, then Kadena as a death goddess must be framed as providing a forbidden alternative to the light and oblivion in terms of the unlife. One possibility, as mentioned in episode 3, would be eternal existence with or as the demonic. Demons of the void, and maybe the pale, and creatures and treasures, are spirits from this world who are damned. How would that fit into Shadow World? At least in an off-canon sense. Issa has 6 keys to the Gates of Oblivion. Only 3 were defined in 1989. The keys of life and death open the Gates of Oblivion. But there's a forbidden key, the key that is never used, called the Key to the Void. And in the 1989 Shadow World books, the Void is associated with demons in the Unlife. For example, at the end of the Wars of Dominion, per 1989, when it was driven by the forces of the Unlife rather than the Dark Gods, The gates of the void were sealed and set with immortal guardians at the end of the wars. This is the most natural and really only sensible Shadow World interpretation for Guardian of the Forbidden. Empress Kadena is dead. Nominally, prior to the Shadow Stone being defined in 1990, you would expect her to end up in Oblivion, or the demonic void if you instead lean on creatures and treasures. In the Ice Age gemstone context, then, it might be that Kadena represents souls choosing darkness, while Issa wants them ending up with the light. And then all these bodies being offered in homage to Vander is an inversion of the sacrifices and good deeds in the Issa deed ceremony. This is fairly plausible because the graveyard and death mechanics were created at roughly the same time, so they could easily have been designed together. But the symbolism of the graveyard would only partly be rooted in canonical Shadow World. It is also paralleling this off-canon stuff with the death mechanics, as well as the off-canon stuff with Empress Kadena. Symbolism, of course, is a matter of interpretation. You have to decide for yourself whether it's really there, so to speak. But there are some fairly convincing parallels between the graveyard, the temple, and purgatory. This brings us to something of an impasse. We are running out of apparently relevant ice material. But there are still unexplained things in the graveyard and death mechanics. What's with the weird purgatory messaging? Why all the archaic thy wording? What's with the deed ceremony and lost to the demonic? Why is Kestrel the lord of the West Country? Why is the graveyard on a northeast axis? Why are the sections of the graveyard in completely different styles? It would be weird for the death stuff to only be partly meaningful and intertwined with the subtle and symbolic graveyard. But whatever additional meaning is in the death stuff is more cryptic. So we start getting into the territory of crypto history, which is a higher degree of speculation. I will not bury the lead. I think parts of it are self-consciously medieval. That would explain the thy stuff, archaic English. But what reasons are there to suspect that we should take words literally with medieval meanings? One thing we might notice is that when you quit the Council of Light, you struggle for your soul in the Justicar's Temple. Justiciar is a pretty obscure medieval English term, essentially a Lord High Judge just under the king. Something else we might notice are claymores, which existed back in 1990. In the real world, these weapons are called claymores, but whoever spelled them claymores in Gemstone, and I'm mispronouncing it, was leaning into their Scottish Gaelic etymology. It comes from claymore, which looks like it should be pronounced claidhime or something like that. In Gaelic, this literally means big sword. Things do not sound like you would expect when reading Gaelic languages. Claymore would, I think, really be pronounced claymore, and whoever spelled it that way probably knew that. But wait, there's more. Recall I mentioned some of the town NPCs are original to Gemstone, that some of their names did not need to be changed. One of these is Magorn Mel in the general store, who dates all the way back to 1990. Meg Mel happens to be Irish, one of the names for the Celtic otherworld, which is therefore both Gaelic and mythology. So there's at least some plausibility to the notion that there could be more cryptic stuff hidden in plain sight. Is there something like this in the temple with the deed ceremony? The deed ceremony, with the ringing of the chimes and all that, is mentioned all the way back in the 1990 newsletters. Various details of the temple are scattered throughout the Kelfour Edition newsletters. The shushing elf, the Shaljin monk, the booming voice, the old priest. Some of it is in the story of how Town Square became a node. Originally, the temple was the big resting spot. While I do not have logs for the temple from back then, the Kelfour Edition does mention the deed priestess, that her name is Tyrion, just as it still is today, meaning it was not changed. Tyrion Betheronian of Ubal. Now, Ubal could conceivably have been some copyrighted Shadow World place name changed to Ubel without ending up on any known conversion list. But usually you can tell what ice word is being replaced just by looking at it. It's not at all obvious what Ubel would have been. Nor is it obvious that Ubel is even a changed word, though its meaning is retconned now. So, could this name actually be medieval language? On spec, Beath is Welsh, meaning eternity. Ubel is medieval German, meaning bad or evil. Ronian could be the Welsh word for maggots. It's hard to say, it's all very speculative. That mostly leaves Tyrion, pronounced probably like Tyrion Lannister. Tyrion in Welsh means compassion. It's possible if Beath is Welsh, but that might not be it. Tyrion spelled more that way is also an alternate spelling of Tir Ewan. That is Irish for land of Ewan. It looks like it should be pronounced Eogain, and there's a player character with this name, but it's really pronounced more like Ewan. The various related languages have slight variations. Ewan, Owen, Owen. What might that mean if it was the intent? Owen is the Welsh variant. Sir Owen in Arthurian legends journeyed into a real place in Ireland called St. Patrick's Purgatory. St. Patrick's Purgatory has been a place of pilgrimage for many centuries. In the legend, Sir Owen is journeying to Purgatory through it. This was in the late 12th century when Purgatory was first being treated as a physical place. That would be damned obscure, but you never know. The most familiar otherworld journey medieval narrative is Dante, of course, but there were a bunch of other Vision Quest stories in that time period, which had Purgatory as a physical place, Sir Owen's legend being one of them. We could also poke around the wording used in the deed ceremony. For example, the fee for my intercession is high, and then Issa, when she rescued you, said she promised to intercede on you, which are two different meanings of the word, perhaps a play on words. And the word fee, etymologically, descends from fiefs. In the medieval context, they are synonyms. The size of the fee is proportional to what is necessary for a knight to continue his feudal duties to the liege lord, which raises the question of the medieval terminology used in the graveyard and his backstory. Fiefdom, liege, homage, pledge, and so on, which could be taken as literal, which leads us to ask, should the deed ceremony be interpreted as medieval homage, with Issa as the liege lord? Homage works by becoming the man of a liege lord, a stronger pledge than just fealty. The liege lords owe protection to those in homage to them, and the fees are feudal tenures, usually land, but it could be anything of value. This typically involves a kneeling ceremony with an altar, as there is in the deed ceremony, where the vassal pledges himself to the liege lord in submission and reverence. In this case, the fee or fief would be the soul. Your soul really, ultimately, belongs to Issa. She's just allowing you to keep it for now. But the dark alternative to that fiefdom is the thraldom of the unlife, where in the story, Banner pledges himself instead to Empress Cadena. In the graveyard, we have two cases of the word homage. In the crypt, we have in homage to that which defies death itself, where death is Issa, and the defiance in this case is probably Banner himself. And deep underground, human sacrifices are left in homage to Banner in the Ice Room. His book is subtitled Power Through Thraldom, and it would seem that thraldom is essentially a feudal hierarchy under the unlife, which would mean Banner is the necropolis liege lord, unlike the lying epitaph on Kestrel's coffin, our lord and liege. The underground does a number of subtle wordplays, at least arguably. It is in the form of a medieval manor, but is also historically accurate in its layout. You enter the banquet hall through the pantry, with the dais on the opposite end, north to south, there'd be a solar room up behind the dais. Again, perhaps the sun symbolism. But in the graveyard, the pantry is called a cabinet, which might be a play on words. Cabinet is a word that instead refers to the private chamber of a lord, not the food pantry, more analogous to the solar room, except this leads down into the darkness, as this is where the grating is leading down to Bander, where his abode is conflated with the larder, which in a medieval manner is known as the ice room, as it is also called in the graveyard. That small slab of ice next to Bander existed in the early 90s. The cold slabs in medieval larders are called thralls. That, again, is damned subtle. Obsolete English. But it is difficult to shake because it is so on the nose. What about the word deeds? On one level, there is an obvious meaning of doing good deeds, sacrificing your treasures. But deed is also the medieval Middle English spelling of the word dead. So it could be read literally as the number of deaths you're owed. Or it could just play into the fiefdom notion. Deeds in the sense of property investitures date back to around 1300. Is there some sense to what doing good deeds has to do with anything? There's nothing about good deeds in the Issa description, aside in the indirect sense of her being a healer. Well, the obvious thing, that is really not obvious at all, is that there is such a thing as the Book of Deeds. That is, in the Book of Revelation, there is a Book of Life next to the throne of God, where what is written in it is based on what people have done. In some translations, according to their deeds. Whoever's name is not in the Book of Life at Judgment Day will suffer the second death, being cast into the lake of fire with death and Hades, where death, of course, is capitalized. This is interesting not only because of the two prophecies line in purgatory, which of course itself is a term of Christian eschatology, but because this is also where River of Life in Shadow World came from, ultimately. River of Life flows from the throne of God in the Book of Revelation, and in Shadow World it flows up to the gates of Oblivion. This is something I'll bring up again with respect to the Drake Shrine on Mount Inatungana, if I do one of these historical series on the Vrail Quest, which is too involved to cover in this series. But second death and lake of fire is a plausible enough theory for a subtextual meaning in the phrase lost to the demonic. It would mean the Book of Revelation was an allegorical subtext for the death mechanics. Whether it was intended or not, I do not know, but it is not ridiculous. So there might be some literal medieval stuff more cryptically in the death mechanics, and possibly some religious allegory with purgatory. Is that everything with purgatory? Well, probably not. We still have no explanation for the surreal imagery. Let's look back over to the graveyard, in the madman's travesty of a throne room in purgatory. Does this give us any clues for possible further hidden meaning? Well, what stands out about this room is its language. I call this the Lovecraft room. It is really a very over-the-top caricature of H.P. Lovecraft. There's an eldritch throne of human ivory, subhumans dancing and gibbering, madness, unfamiliar constellations. Lovecraft is notorious for writing that things are too horrible to be described, unspeakable. You see that here, and in the crypt, and in the graveyard backstory itself. In fact, if you read the legend of the Necropolis of Etrivion through that lens, it is very easy to interpret Bander as a Lovecraftian protagonist. The stereotypical Lovecraft protagonist is weird, highly intelligent, sensitive, obsessed with dangerous, forbidden knowledge, as well as esotericism along the lines of astral projection, summoning things from other worlds, ancient demonic powers and long-forgotten elder races, monstrous dormant forces. And like them, Bander is driven mad, suffering from evil dreams, with sanity-shattering knowledge. It isn't clear if specific stories are especially relevant. Possible inspirations easily suggest themselves. His behavior with obscure quests and hobbies fits of possession, anachronisms, and perhaps unnatural knowledge, is reminiscent of the shadow out of time. His theft of the ancient knowledge from Namikos could have come from the end of the Dunwich Horror, with Wilbur Whately and the Horror, his brother, David. No, I kid, I jest. But Wilbur Whately gets himself killed at night trying to steal the unabridged translation of the Necronomicon from the Miskatonic University Library. The Whateleys were a natural offspring of Yog-Sothoth, the gate, key, and guardian of forbidden knowledge who exists outside of time itself, which can motivate an entirely distinct meaning for Kadena as guardian of the forbidden, or her being dead but not truly dead, like Cthulhu, instead sleeping for strange eons. If you're looking at the graveyard itself, the next room over is lit with glowing fungus, possibly the first time that was done in Gemstone. That is something Lovecraft does in some of his stories. You also see it in the Broken Lands in Shadow Valley. The Broken Lands in Shadow Valley, I think, also have some Lovecraft in them. The throne looking like melted wax and the half-face in the next room could be from the Horror in the Museum, which happened to be re-released in a Lovecraft anthology under that title in 1989. They were stories he ghost wrote or co-authored with others. The dug-up-from-underground cannibal chamber could come from the rats in the wall, where Lovecraft was inspired by St. Patrick's Purgatory. I would be shocked if that was intentional. The signal with specific details like that is way down in the noise. So, let's assume there's a Lovecraft dimension to the graveyard story. This throne room is drenched in Lovecraftian conceits. The throne room is also symbolic of purgatory. What if the weird purgatory messaging itself comes from Lovecraft? That is, what if it is literally weird fiction? The first thing that lends itself to us is that there is an oblivion in Lovecraft's dream cycle stories. It is an actual place, and moreover, it is reached by your consciousness leaving your body. It is mentioned in Through the Gates of the Silver Key, for example, where Randolph Carter sees many other versions of himself in a timeless void. And in the prose poem Ex Oblivion, oblivion is reached by drinking soporific potions, as we see Bander do in the story. The dreamer is dream-walking, or astral projecting, approaching a bronze gate that then opens. When they travel through the irrepassable gate, all memory and sense of identity washes away into oblivion, and more subtly, so do all colors. Which is what happens when characters have permanent death in Gemstone, with oblivion taken literally. Lovecraft was on a Schopenhauer kick at the time he wrote it. It ends with a line about the demon life. I dissolved again into that native infinity of crystal oblivion, from which the demon life had called me, for one brief, desolate hour. Lost to the demonic in this frame could mean lost to real life, but who knows. As an aside, notice that the path around the crypt and burial mound forms an infinity symbol, with the center being one of the blind spot runes. There is a room in the rift with a robed man walking away on a dark path with a tarnished infinity symbol over his head. Though in the case of the rift, it is clearly based on the magician card from tarot decks. Whether it is really there in the graveyard is not obvious, but worth mentioning, as it symbolizes oblivion. That would only cover some of it. What about this creeping doom and timeless stuff? So I went looking through Lovecraft's works, which is dangerous, because of the hazard of confirmation bias. It turns out there is extremely similar language at the end of another Randolph Carter story called The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath. The doomed and desperate dreamer leaps into the darkness and plunges to the waking world of his childhood memories, which can explain the world of your memories rushing back to you line, which no longer exists in the death messaging, as well as the recall old prayers forgotten since youth line when looking at Bander. And we notice that, past the grating, you are actually on the edge of plunging into pitch blackness. Then we might also notice, though not get into it in this series, that this is also done literally with the phrase waking world in the Shadow Valley exit, as well as the entrance to the rift, and falling is part of the special death mechanics by Lover's Leap and Terrace. Waking world is the term for the material physical world in that story. It is used 12 times. That would be a damned weird coincidence in Shadow Valley. Nor is this all of the curious cryptic instances of falling from great heights done in the 1990s. Like there's a fall you take in Black Swan Castle that uses the but alive conceit. But that's too much of a digression. So, the dream quest of Unknown Kadath is Randolph Carter going on a quest in the Dreamlands, a parallel dimension accessed by dreaming, seeking the gods of Earth's dreamlands. He has a dream vision of a marvelous city, but ends up losing it. So he's seeking them out to find out what gives. It turns out it's his own childhood memories of Boston. And they went there themselves while he was seeking them out, and they were missing. The antagonist of the story is the demonic outer god, Nyarlathotep, who has a very mocking and ironic sense of humor. Nyarlathotep is described as a cross between an Egyptian pharaoh and a fallen archangel or dark god, which is something I will bring up again in the next episode. Vander is our analog of Nyarlathotep. He tries to trick Randolph Carter into flying toward Azathoth, essentially to his doom, and Carter remembers he is only dreaming and leaps into the infinite darkness. Eons reel with cosmic cycles of vast time, and there are presences of awareness tugging at him akin to the vying in the purgatory messaging. Then the world of his memories rushes back to him, and he wakes up in his room, and Nyarlathotep captures and brings back the gods. If I do one of these historical series on the Broken Lands, all of this will come up again, because there's a short scene that takes place in the underworld of the Dreamlands earlier in the story, and that is a very, very strong parallel to the room painting of the 1994 expansion of the Broken Lands, which I think was also made as a dark parallel of the death mechanics. And as I've said, Vander and Uthex probably knew each other. That's long enough for this episode. We went through the Rolemaster and Shadow World source material about death, and used that to figure out what about Gemstone was off-canon. Then we looked at the death symbolism of the graveyard, recognizing it as a dark mirror of the gates of oblivion. Then, as a thought experiment, we took the medieval words in both it and the death mechanics literally, asking what that would imply, constructing a dark parallel of the death religion based on rival forms of medieval homage with the fate of souls, which is totally off-canon and has nothing to do with the I.C.E source books. It is purely implicit. This involved noticing that there might be subtle wordplays encoded in the room painting. Lastly, we looked at potential candidates for allegory in the death mechanics, trying to explain what still had no explanation. One of these approached prophecy from the direction of eschatology in the Book of Revelation. That's particularly relevant since the unlife ultimately wants to destroy existence, resulting in nothingness, and it's somewhat ironic that Oblivion and Gemstone is essentially that. The other noticed a high propensity of Lovecraftian language and conceits, and then identified the purgatory messaging as probably based on a few Lovecraft stories involving oblivion or the mind leaving the body for another dimension. So, in the last episode of this historical exploration series, we have to tie everything together and explain what is left of the graveyard. As you will see, I think there is one more major piece of real-world literature involved, in some respects an obvious one, but then I think the crypt and burial mound are as historically informed as the medieval manor deep underground. That is, in an archaeological sense, since these forms of burial come from real-world religions, and this will all be unified in terms of comparative mythology. The fundamental formula of Lovecraft plus Shadow World plus comparative mythology is how I interpret the other places in the game that I think are related to the graveyard on some level. Shadow Valley, of course, is reached through the graveyard. The relative weights of those factors varies in each of the cases, but there are only a small handful of these cases. Most stuff in Gemstone doesn't have some grand sign of hidden meaning, but a few things apparently do. Thank you for watching this fourth installment of my historical exploration series on the graveyard. Hopefully you have learned something worth knowing, because knowing is half the battle.